Apollo 11. The complete story. Houston, we've had a problem. Because what I'm about to tell you is how a 10-cent ballpoint pen, a broken switch, and 30 seconds of fuel turned humanity's greatest achievement into one of the most dangerous missions ever attempted, and how we almost lost Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon forever. The story nobody tells you. Look, everyone knows Neil Armstrong said, "One small step for man." But nobody talks about the fact that he almost didn't make it back to tell anyone about it. See, there's this moment 21 hours after they landed when Buzz Aldrin is staring at a broken piece of plastic smaller than your thumb, and he realizes that this tiny, broken switch is the only thing standing between them and dying on the moon. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you why this whole insane mission happened in the first place. Because the story of Apollo 11 isn't really about space exploration. It's about fear, pride, and what happens when two superpowers decide to use the moon as their battleground. It started with fear. October 4th, 1957. Americans are sitting down to dinner when the radio crackles to life. The Soviet Union has successfully launched the world's first artificial satellite. Now, imagine you're an American in 1957. You've just won World War II. You're the most powerful nation on Earth. Your cars are bigger, your economy is stronger, your technology is better, and suddenly, the Soviets, your sworn enemies, have put a metal ball in space that's beeping over your head every 90 minutes. It might as well have been screaming, "We can hit you from space, and you can't stop us." The panic was immediate. Newspapers called it a Pearl Harbor in space. Congress held emergency sessions. Parents looked up at the night sky and wondered if their children would live to see adulthood. But the real shock came 4 years later. April 12, 1961. The Soviets don't just put a satellite in space, they put a human being up there. Yuri Gagarin orbits the Earth and comes back down alive. America? We'd barely gotten a rocket off the ground without it exploding. Our first attempt at a satellite launch, the Vanguard rocket exploded on the pad. The newspapers called it Kaputnik and Flopnik. The world was laughing at us. So when President Kennedy stands up in front of Congress on May 25th, 1961, and says, "We're going to the moon before 1970, half the country thinks he's lost his mind.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Hard? Try impossible. We're talking about 1961 here. The most advanced computer filled an entire room and had less processing power than a modern calculator. No GPS, no internet, no cell phones. The most advanced technology most people owned was a television set. And Kennedy wants to shoot 3 guys 240,000 miles into space, land them on another world, and bring them back alive. With 1960s technology. But here's what Kennedy understood that most people didn't. Sometimes you have to attempt the impossible to achieve the extraordinary. The price of ambition. So NASA gets to work. And by work, I mean they throw everything they have at this problem. Money, people, resources, everything. $24 billion. 400,000 engineers, scientists, and technicians. 4% of the entire federal budget. At its peak, 1 out of every 50 working Americans was involved in the Apollo program. Think about that. 1 in 50. But then, January 27th, 1967, reality hits them like a freight train. 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, are running a routine test on the launch pad. It's Apollo 1, just a test, nothing dangerous. They're not even going to space. The cabin is pressurized with pure oxygen. It's a known fire hazard, but they figured it would be fine for a few hours. At 6:31 p.m., someone moves in the cabin. There's a spark, maybe from a wire, maybe from Velcro, maybe from static electricity. Nobody knows for sure. In pure oxygen, that tiny spark becomes a blowtorch. In 17 seconds, all 3 men are dead, killed by the spacecraft that was supposed to take them to the moon. The hatch was designed to open inward, sealed by cabin pressure. As the fire consumed the oxygen, the pressure actually increased. The astronauts couldn't open the door from the inside. The ground crew couldn't open it from outside because of the heat and smoke. Gus Grissom had complained about the spacecraft safety issues just weeks before. He'd said, "If we die, we want people to accept it. We're in a risky business." But nobody expected them to die on the ground. NASA could have quit right there. Congress could have pulled the plug. The families could have said, "This is too dangerous." Instead, they did something incredible. They used the tragedy to completely redesign the spacecraft. They changed the cabin atmosphere to a nitrogen-oxygen mix. They redesigned the hatch to open outward in seconds. They replaced flammable materials with fire-resistant ones. They installed emergency escape systems. Joe Shea, one of the Apollo program managers, later said, "We learned more about spacecraft safety in those few months after the fire than we had in the previous 6 years." Those 3 men didn't die for nothing. They died so that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin could live. The road to the moon. After Apollo 1, NASA launched a series of increasingly complex missions. Each one was designed to test a different piece of the puzzle. Apollo 4, 5, and 6 were unmanned tests. They tested the giant Saturn V rocket that would send men to the moon. These rockets were monsters 363 feet tall, weighing 6.2 million pounds when fully fueled. The first Saturn V test was so loud that CBS anchorman Walter Cronkite was knocked backward in his chair a mile away from the launch pad. The sound waves shattered windows 3 miles away. Apollo 7 in October 1968 was the first manned mission after the fire. 11 months of delays, redesigns, and testing. The crew spent 11 days in Earth orbit, testing every system on the spacecraft. But Apollo 8 was the game changer. December 1968. 3 men, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders, became the first humans to leave Earth orbit and travel to the moon. They didn't land, they just orbited the moon 10 times and came home. But when they arrived at the moon on Christmas Eve, they did something nobody expected. We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. They read from the book of Genesis as Earth rose over the lunar horizon. It was the most watched television broadcast in history at the time.
Amen.
Apollo 9 in March 1969 tested the lunar module in Earth orbit. This was the first time anyone had flown the fragile spacecraft that would actually land on the moon. The lunar module was weird. It looked like a giant spider made of aluminum foil and hope. It had no aerodynamic properties, because it was never designed to fly in an atmosphere. It was built for space and space alone. Apollo 10 in May 1969 was the dress rehearsal. 3 astronauts flew to the moon and did everything Apollo 11 would do, except actually land. They got within 8 miles of the surface and then came home. Tom Stafford, the commander, later said it was the most frustrating mission of his career. They were so close to the moon they could see individual rocks, but they weren't allowed to land. And then, finally, it was time. The impossible becomes possible. Fast forward to July 16, 1969. A 363-foot tall rocket sits on the launch pad in Florida. Inside, 3 men wait to attempt the impossible. Neil Armstrong, the quiet test pilot from Ohio who never backed down from a challenge. He'd flown 78 combat missions in Korea, test piloted the X-15 rocket plane, and had already been to space once on Gemini 8. Buzz Aldrin, the systems expert with a PhD in orbital mechanics from MIT. His nickname was Dr. Rendezvous because he'd figured out how to dock spacecraft in orbit. And Michael Collins, the man who would orbit the moon alone while his crewmates made history. He'd been to space on Gemini 10 and was known for his dry sense of humor. Armstrong was so calm under pressure that his heart rate never went above 85 beats per minute during the landing. For reference, my heart rate is probably higher than that right now just talking about it. Aldrin was a perfectionist who'd spent years calculating the precise maneuvers needed to land on the moon. He'd literally written the book on Space Rendezvous. Collins was the forgotten man of Apollo 11, but he might have had the most important job. If something went wrong on the moon, he was the only one who could fly the command module home. The Saturn V rocket burns 15 tons of fuel per second. 15 tons per second. The exhaust flame is 200 feet long and hot enough to melt steel. But here's what most people don't understand about Apollo 11. This wasn't just one spacecraft. It was 3 spacecraft stuck together, designed to come apart at exactly the right moments. The command module their home for the week-long journey. This was where they ate, slept, and would ride back to Earth. It was about the size of a large car interior. The service module, their engine, fuel, and life support. This provided power, water, and oxygen for the entire mission. And the lunar module, a fragile, one-use spacecraft designed for one purpose: land on the moon and get back to lunar orbit. The lunar module was so fragile that if you leaned against it too hard on Earth, you could put a hole in it. The walls were thinner than aluminum foil in some places. But it didn't need to be strong. It would never encounter wind or weather. Only 2 men could land. The lunar module was too small and too fragile to carry 3 people. Michael Collins would stay behind in the command module, orbiting the moon alone. No backup. No rescue mission. If something went wrong, Collins would have to return to Earth by himself and tell the world that his friends were dead. The loneliness Collins would face is hard to imagine. For 21 hours, he'd be completely alone, further from Earth than any human had ever been. When he passed behind the moon, he'd be cut off from all radio contact. No voices, no music, no human connection at all. He later said, "I was aware of being alone in a way that no Earthling has ever been before." The journey to the moon. The trip to the moon takes 3 days. 3 days of floating in a space smaller than a small bathroom, with no privacy, no shower, and freeze-dried food. But the real challenge wasn't physical, it was psychological. They were traveling to an alien world that no human had ever touched. They had no idea what they'd find there. Would the lunar module sink into the dust? Would the moon's surface be too rough to land on? Would they be able to take off again? On July 19th, after traveling 240,000 miles, Apollo 11 arrived at the moon. The first thing they did was orbit the moon, taking photographs and looking for the best landing site. The moon is not a friendly place. There's no atmosphere, no weather, no life. The temperature in sunlight is 250 degrees Fahrenheit. In shadow, it's minus 250 degrees. On July 20th, it was time to separate the spacecraft. Collins would stay in the command module, nicknamed Columbia. Armstrong and Aldrin would take the lunar module, nicknamed Eagle, down to the surface. At 1:47 p.m., the Eagle separated from Columbia. Collins watched his crewmates disappear toward the moon's surface. "You cats take it easy on the lunar surface," he radioed. "See you later." Those might have been the last words he ever spoke to them. 25 seconds from disaster. July 20th, 1969, 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. The Eagle is descending toward the moon's surface. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin are strapped in, watching the computer guide them down toward a place called the Sea of Tranquility. Everything is going according to plan. The automatic guidance system is working perfectly. They're on course for a safe landing. And then, at 6 miles above the surface, the alarms start screaming. Program alarm, 1201, 1201. Neither Armstrong nor Aldrin knows what that means. These are test pilots, the best in the world, and they've never heard this alarm before. They're flying blind, 6 miles above the moon's surface, traveling at 3,000 miles per hour, and their computer is having a breakdown. In mission control, 26-year-old Steve Bales is frantically flipping through manuals. He's the guidance officer, and suddenly the fate of the mission depends on his decision. The 1201 alarm means the computer is overloaded. It's trying to do too many things at once. But the critical question is, can it still land the spacecraft safely? We're go on that alarm, we're go. They decide to trust the computer, keep going. At 3,000 feet, the Eagle is flying over the lunar landscape faster than anyone had expected. The computer is taking them toward a crater filled with boulders the size of cars. At 1,000 feet, Armstrong realizes they're heading for disaster. At 500 feet, he grips the controls. Out the window, a crater full of car-sized boulders rushes up to meet them. He takes manual control. Now he's flying a machine he's never flown before, in gravity he's never experienced, toward a surface he's never seen. The lunar module handles like a helicopter, but Armstrong has never flown a helicopter. Fuel crisis. At 200 feet, Buzz Aldrin checks the fuel gauge. They're running out of fuel. Fast. At 100 feet, 5%. They have maybe 30 seconds of fuel left. If they don't land right now, they'll crash or have to abort the mission. 15 seconds of fuel. 10 seconds. 5. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. The Eagle has touched down with less than 20 seconds of fuel remaining. If Armstrong had hesitated for even a moment longer, they would have crashed. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. In mission control, grown men are crying. They've just witnessed the impossible. But the astronauts can't celebrate yet. They're on the moon, but they're not safe. They still have to survive the lunar surface, take off again, and make it home. And they have no idea that they've already broken the one thing they need to leave. The accident that almost killed them. After landing, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin have to prepare for their moonwalk. They put on their spacesuits, check their equipment, and prepare to open the hatch. The hatch is tiny. I mean really tiny. It's 32 inches wide and 32 inches tall, about the size of a large window, and they have to squeeze through it wearing spacesuits that make them look like the Michelin Man. Armstrong goes first. He's backing out of the hatch feet first, trying to maneuver his bulky life support backpack through the opening. His backpack catches on something. There's a small snap barely audible in the vacuum of space. A piece of plastic smaller than your thumb breaks off and floats away. Armstrong doesn't think anything of it, just a piece of plastic. What could go wrong? What broke was the ascent engine arm switch, the one switch that would allow them to fire their engine to leave the moon. Without it, they were stranded. For the next 21 hours, while the world celebrated, while they planted the flag and collected moon rocks, while they talked to President Nixon on the phone, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were walking dead men. They just didn't know it yet. One small step. At 10:56 p.m. Eastern Time, Neil Armstrong opens the hatch and steps onto the moon's surface. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. 650 million people are watching on television. It's the most watched event in human history. But what people don't realize is how dangerous this moment is. Armstrong is wearing a spacesuit that's basically a personal spacecraft. One tear, one malfunction, one mistake, and he's dead in seconds. The moon has no atmosphere, no air pressure. If his suit fails, his blood will boil, his saliva will boil. He'll have maybe 15 seconds of consciousness before he dies. 19 minutes later, Buzz Aldrin joins him on the surface. Together, they spend 2 hours and 31 minutes outside the lunar module. They collect 47 pounds of moon rocks and dust. They plant an American flag. They set up scientific experiments. They take photographs that will be studied for decades. But they're working against the clock. They have a limited supply of oxygen, a limited supply of battery power, and a limited time window to take off from the moon. Back on Earth, the world has stopped. Traffic jams clear as people rush home to watch. Bars and restaurants have their televisions turned up loud. In Times Square, crowds gather around electronic billboards. For a few hours, humanity is united in watching two of their own walk on another world. President Nixon calls them from the White House. "Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Office at the White House. And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made. But Armstrong and Aldrin can't enjoy the moment. They have work to do, and they're running out of time." The 10-cent solution. 21 hours after landing, Armstrong and Aldrin are back in the Eagle, preparing to leave the moon. They've completed their mission. They've collected samples, taken photographs, and planted the flag. Now they just have to get home alive. Buzz Aldrin is going through the pre-launch checklist when he notices something wrong. The ascent engine arm switch, the switch that would allow them to fire their engine, is missing. Not broken. Missing. The entire switch assembly has snapped off and is floating somewhere in the cabin. Without this switch, they cannot start the engine. Without the engine, they cannot leave the moon. Without leaving the moon, they cannot go home. They call Houston. "We have a problem." In mission control, the silence is deafening. How do you fix a spacecraft with no spare parts, no tools, no backup, when you're 240,000 miles from the nearest hardware store? The engineers start brainstorming. Can they bypass the switch? Can they use another switch? Can they manually start the engine? Meanwhile, on the moon, Buzz Aldrin is staring at the broken circuit. He needs something, anything, that can complete the electrical connection. He looks around the cramped cabin. Space food, life support equipment, scientific instruments worth millions of dollars, camera equipment, sample containers, emergency supplies. And then he sees it. A ballpoint pen. A simple 10-cent ballpoint pen that he'd brought to take notes. Aldrin realizes that the metal tip of the pen is conductive. If he can jam it into the switch housing, it might complete the circuit. He carefully inserts the pen tip into the broken switch mechanism. The fit is perfect. He presses the pen tip down, completing the circuit. The engine fires. A ballpoint pen, a piece of technology that's been around for decades, saved the most advanced mission in human history. The journey home gets worse. But their troubles weren't over. Getting off the moon was just the beginning. Now they had to rendezvous with Michael Collins, who had been orbiting the moon alone for 21 hours. The Eagle had to catch up with the Columbia command module, which was traveling at 3,700 miles per hour. If they missed this rendezvous, there was no second chance. Collins couldn't come down to get them. But the rendezvous worked perfectly. The Eagle docked with Columbia, and for the first time in almost a day, all 3 astronauts were together again. They transferred the moon rocks and film to the command module, then jettisoned the Eagle. Their faithful lunar module, which had carried them to the moon and back, was pushed away to crash into the lunar surface. Now began the 3-day journey back to Earth. But this leg of the trip presented new dangers. During re-entry, the service module was supposed to separate cleanly from the command module and burn up harmlessly in Earth's atmosphere. NASA had tested this procedure dozens of times, but something went wrong. Instead of separating cleanly, the service module started breaking apart right next to the command module. Chunks of their own spacecraft were tumbling past their windows like shrapnel. Any one of those pieces could punch through the command module's heat shield and kill them all during re-entry. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins could only sit there and watch as debris from their own ship floated around them in slow motion. If the heat shield was damaged, they would burn up during re-entry. There was no way to repair it, no way to check it, no way to know if it was intact until they hit the atmosphere. President Nixon was so certain they would die that he had already written their eulogy. Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know that there is no hope for their recovery. The speech was ready to be delivered if the astronauts died during re-entry, but somehow the debris missed them. The heat shield held. The command module survived re-entry intact. And on July 24, 1969, at 12:50 p.m. Eastern Time, 3 men splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, alive and safe. The impossible had become possible. Humans had walked on the moon and returned to tell about it. The conspiracy that won't die. But here's where the story gets weird, because more than 50 years later, millions of people still believe none of this actually happened. They think the whole thing was filmed on a soundstage, that NASA faked the moon landing to beat the Soviets in the Cold War. Look, I get it. The footage looks strange. The lighting seems off. The flag appears to wave when there's no air. The shadows look wrong. There are no stars in the photos. But here's the thing, every single one of these mysteries has a simple explanation that anyone can verify. The flag? It had a horizontal rod sewn into the top to keep it extended. When the astronauts planted the flag, the rod jammed halfway, creating ripples that look like waving. You can see in the footage that the flag only waves when the astronauts are touching it. When they let go, it stops moving immediately and stays perfectly still. No stars in the photos? The lunar surface was brightly lit by the sun. The camera exposures were set for daylight conditions. Try this experiment. Take a flash photo at night. You won't see stars in the background either, even though they're clearly visible to your eyes. Weird shadows? The moon's surface was acting like a giant mirror, reflecting sunlight in all directions. This created multiple light sources and strange shadow patterns. Plus, the moon's surface isn't flat. It's covered with craters, rocks, and hills that create their own shadows. But here's the real kicker. Faking the moon landing would have been harder than actually going to the moon. The slow-motion footage of the astronauts bouncing around, that's exactly how humans would move in 1/6 gravity. We didn't have the technology to fake that in 1969. The lunar dust that kicks up and falls in perfect parabolas? That's exactly how dust behaves in a vacuum. We couldn't have faked that either. But here's the most compelling evidence that it was real. The Soviet Union confirmed it. Think about that. America's greatest enemy, who had every reason to expose a fake, acknowledged the achievement in their official publications. The Soviets had their own space program, their own tracking stations, their own scientists. They were monitoring every aspect of the Apollo missions. If the moon landing was faked, the Soviets would have been screaming about it from the rooftops. Instead, they congratulated NASA. So why do some people still doubt one of humanity's greatest achievements? To understand this, we need to put ourselves in the shoes of 1969. Many adults watching Neil Armstrong's first steps had grown up in a world without electricity, riding horses to school, living on farms without running water. In just one lifetime, they witnessed humanity leap from horse and buggy to rocket ships. Even in 1969, much of America's population was still rural, living in small towns where the most advanced technology might be a television set. Imagine you grew up riding horses, churning butter by hand, and using outhouses, then someone tells you humans just traveled 240,000 miles through the vacuum of space and walked on another world. We landed on the moon? It was almost beyond comprehension. Even people with scientific and technical backgrounds struggled to grasp the sheer audacity of what NASA had accomplished. The technological leap was so dramatic, so seemingly impossible, that skepticism felt rational. The moon landing conspiracies persist because they tap into that same sense of disbelief. Even though we now live in an age where we carry more computing power in our pockets than the entire Apollo program had. But the evidence is overwhelming. We have thousands of photos, hours of footage, moon rocks studied by scientists worldwide, and retroreflectors still bouncing lasers back to Earth. The technical challenges of faking the moon landing in 1969 would have been far more difficult than actually going there. The Apollo program represents humanity at its best, pushing beyond our limits with courage and determination. When we landed on the moon, we took a giant leap for all mankind. That achievement deserves to be celebrated, not diminished by unfounded doubt. The moon is still there, waiting, and the footprints we left in 1969 are still there too. Proof that sometimes the most incredible stories are simply true. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed exploring this fascinating piece of history with me, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries and truths that shape our world. What topics should we tackle next? Let me know in the comments below.